Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. In 1989, a night in Central Park turned into one of the most shocking stories in New York's history. A young woman was attacked, 5 teenagers were arrested, and the city was torn apart. For some, it was proof of guilt. For others, it was a story of injustice. What followed divided families, communities, and an entire nation. In the late 1980s, New York City was a place of both wonder and fear. People came from all over the world to see the tall buildings, the lights of Times Square, and the busy streets that never seemed to rest. But the city also carried a darker side. Crime rates were high and many neighborhoods were struggling. Residents read about robberies and assaults in the newspapers almost every day, and the feeling of danger was never too far away. For families living in New York, daily life was a mix of beauty and tension. Central Park was the heart of the city. On a sunny afternoon, it looked like a safe escape, filled with joggers, children, and couples enjoying the open space. But at night, it became something else. The trees grew darker, the paths felt endless, and shadows seemed to stretch forever. People whispered warnings about going into the park after dark. It was a place loved by the city, yet feared at the same time. On one night in April 1989, the park became the center of a story that would change New York forever. That evening, groups of teenagers from Harlem gathered together. Some were just hanging out, some were joking, and some had nothing serious in mind. But as the night went on, things began to shift. A few of the boys moved through the park, yelling, laughing, and sometimes harassing people they came across. To some of them, it felt like just wild teenage behavior. To others, it was reckless and dangerous. At the same time, a young woman, a professional working in the city, went out for her usual run. She was someone who used the park for exercise and release after long workdays. She had no idea that her path would cross with events that would soon shock the world. As she moved through the dimly lit park, her steps echoed against the silence of the night. The trees, the winding paths, and the open stretches of grass surrounded her. It was supposed to be a routine run, something she had done many times before. Somewhere else in the park, police officers began to notice disturbances. Calls had come in about groups of teenagers causing trouble. Officers started moving in to break things up, chasing groups here and there, pulling some boys aside and questioning others. The park, which was usually quiet at that hour, suddenly became filled with movement, with shouts and flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then came the discovery. In a remote area of the park, a woman was found badly injured. She had been attacked, and the scene was disturbing. Officers quickly called for help. News of the assault spread fast among the police at the park, and word soon reached the city's newspapers and television stations. The story was explosive. A young woman attacked in Central Park at a time when crime was already at the center of public fear. By the next morning, headlines screamed about the case. The city woke up to shocking news. Reporters spoke about the dangers of the park, the rising crime in New York, and the question of who could have done such a thing. Politicians and city leaders demanded answers. People living in apartments near the park began to look out their windows with new caution. Parents told their children to stay close to home. The city's fear had turned into full-blown panic. Police quickly connected the teenagers they had picked up that night with the attack. Some of the boys were only 14 or 15 years old. They were brought into police stations, questioned for hours, and pressured to explain where they had been and what they had seen. Some of them admitted to being in the park, but the details were messy. The story became more complicated with every passing hour. Families of the boys rushed to the stations, confused and afraid. For many of them, their children had never been in serious trouble before. The parents begged officers to let their kids go home, but detectives insisted the boys knew more than they were saying. To the police, this case had to be solved quickly. The entire city was watching, and every moment of delay felt like failure. On the streets, the mood grew heavier. People argued in grocery stores and on buses about what had happened. Some were quick to believe the boys were guilty. Others felt something was wrong, that maybe the police were moving too fast. The case was already dividing New Yorkers. In Harlem, the community watched the events with worry. Many parents thought about their own children, who sometimes went out with friends, laughed loudly, or acted careless in the city's public spaces. Could their sons also be picked up one night, accused of something so terrible? In wealthier parts of Manhattan, the fear was different. Residents there demanded action and justice. They wanted to feel safe again, and they wanted someone to be held responsible. The Central Park case was no longer just a crime. It was becoming a storm of opinions, fear, and anger. Television cameras followed every update. Reporters stood outside police precincts waiting for new details. The words Central Park suddenly carried a new meaning. In living rooms across the city, families sat together watching the news, whispering about what they believed. At dinner tables, voices were raised, some saying the boys had to be guilty, others asking if the truth was being rushed. The city was splitting apart, and this was only the beginning. That first night in the park was just the spark. The real story, the one that would last for years, shape debates, and change lives, was only starting. And as the teenagers sat in those police rooms, and as the young woman fought for her life in the hospital, no one in New York knew just how much this case would divide the city and the country. The morning after the attack, New York City was buzzing with tension. The news had spread quickly, and every newspaper carried the shocking story. Headlines shouted about a brutal assault in Central Park. Reporters described the young woman as a bright, hard-working professional who had gone out for her usual evening run. Her condition was critical, and she was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. The public reaction was immediate. For many, the case seemed to confirm their worst fears about the city. People were already living with high crime, and now even Central Park, a place that symbolized the city's heart, felt unsafe. Calls flooded radio stations with angry voices demanding swift justice. Parents warned their children not to leave the house at night, and office workers avoided the park even during the day. Inside police stations, detectives worked without rest. They already had several teenagers in custody, and they believed they were close to solving the case. Officers questioned the boys again and again, trying to piece together what had happened. The boys were young, some as young as 14, others only a little older. They sat in small rooms under bright lights, with detectives pressing them for answers. The questioning went on for hours. Some of the boys gave confused and changing statements. They admitted being in the park, but the details didn't always match. Some claimed they had seen the woman but denied hurting her. Others described being part of the group but insisted they had nothing to do with the attack. The more they spoke, the more tangled the story became. Detectives faced enormous pressure. The case was now national news, and the entire city was waiting for results. Political leaders demanded quick action. The police felt they could not walk away without answers. They believed the boys knew more than they admitted, and they wanted confessions. The families of the teenagers were desperate. Parents rushed to the stations, some begging to be allowed into the rooms, others shouting at officers for questioning their children without them present. But the police pushed forward. To them, the case was clear. A group of boys had gone into the park that night, and a terrible crime had taken place. As the questioning dragged on, some of the boys began to break down. They were tired, frightened, and confused. They wanted to go home, and they wanted the long hours to end. Eventually, a few of them gave statements that seemed to link them to the attack. Detectives quickly wrote everything down. To the police, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The news spread again. Reporters gathered outside the station as word came out that confessions had been made. Cameras flashed as the boys were led in and out, some with their heads down, others with blank expressions. Their faces appeared in newspapers across the city, and soon the whole country knew their names. The reaction was explosive. Many New Yorkers felt relief, convinced that the attackers had been caught. But others began to question the story. Neighbors in Harlem, where most of the boys lived, felt uneasy. They wondered how teenagers could suddenly be accused of such a brutal act. Some parents in the community feared that the boys were being treated unfairly because of their age and background. In the hospital, the young woman remained in critical condition. Doctors worked tirelessly to keep her alive. Her family stayed close, shocked by what had happened. They were deeply pained, but also hopeful that justice would be served. For them, the news of arrests brought some comfort, even as their daughter's future remained uncertain. As days passed, the media fueled the fire. Television shows aired endless discussions. often painting the boys as guilty before the trial even began. Newspapers printed dramatic stories calling the crime a symbol of the city's decay. The words "wolf pack" appeared in headlines describing the teenagers as predators. It was language that stirred public anger and made the divide even deeper. The boys' families protested. They insisted their sons were innocent, that they had been pressured and frightened into giving statements they didn't understand. Lawyers began to step in, demanding fair treatment and warning that the case was being rushed. But the voices of defense were often drowned out by the loud chorus calling for punishment. In the streets of New York, people argued openly. On buses, in shops, and in schools, the case was all anyone could talk about. Some believed the boys were dangerous and deserved the harshest penalty. Others believed the system was targeting them because they were poor and from minority backgrounds. The case was no longer just about one crime. It was about race, class, fear, and the city's struggles. For the police, the case became a symbol of their ability to protect the city. They presented the confessions as proof, even though the details didn't always fit perfectly. They were convinced they had solved the crime, and that was the message they wanted the public to believe. But in quiet corners, doubt remained. Some detectives noticed gaps in the story. Some reporters wondered if the truth was more complicated. And within the city, the feeling of division grew stronger. Central Park, once a symbol of escape, had become a reminder of fear and conflict. The teenagers, now at the center of the storm, faced an uncertain future. Their lives had changed overnight. From ordinary boys in their neighborhoods, they had become the most talked-about faces in America. Some were confused by what they had said in the station. Some barely understood the seriousness of what was happening. But soon they would understand. The Central Park case was moving quickly toward the courts. The city was ready for trials, and the families on both sides prepared for battles that would last years. New York was holding its breath, caught between fear and doubt, waiting for justice. But justice itself was already a word divided. The case moved forward quickly, and the spotlight only grew brighter. By now, the teenagers were no longer just suspects. They were the focus of a national story. Every newspaper carried their pictures, and every television channel replayed their names. They were still children in many ways, but the world now looked at them as something much larger. Inside the police precincts, the boys sat for more questioning. Detectives believed they had the answers, and they wanted to tie every piece together. The statements the boys had given were inconsistent, but the police pushed to shape them into one story. Some detectives saw holes in the confessions, but the pressure from the public was too strong. They felt they could not step back, even if things did not perfectly add up. The boys themselves were overwhelmed. They had been pulled into something they could barely understand. For some, the hours of questioning had felt endless. They were young, tired, and scared. Some of them repeated things they thought the police wanted to hear. Others denied being involved, but those voices were lost in the noise. Once the confessions were written down, the damage was done. Lawyers began to get involved. Defense attorneys argued that the police had forced the boys into false statements. They said the questioning was unfair, that parents were not allowed to sit in, and that the boys had been pushed into admitting things they never did. But by then, the public had already chosen sides. Many people believed the boys were guilty and nothing could change their minds. The victim's condition slowly improved, though she had suffered terrible injuries. She could not remember what had happened in the park that night. This became a crucial point. Without her memory, the entire case rested on the confessions and the physical evidence. And while some evidence was collected, it did not clearly connect the boys to the crime. Still, the pressure to convict remained heavy. In Harlem, the mood was one of fear and anger. Families felt their community was being painted as dangerous. Neighbors gathered to discuss the case, some defending the boys, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Parents worried every time their children went out, knowing the city now looked at young men from their neighborhood with suspicion. In other parts of New York, especially wealthier areas, the mood was very different. Residents there were furious. They wanted safety restored. They wanted justice. And to them, the arrests were proof that police had done their job. The Central Park case became a symbol of two different New Yorks, one that demanded punishment and one that feared injustice. The media poured fuel onto the fire. Television reports replayed images of the boys being taken in by police. Newspapers printed strong words, calling them monsters, predators, and threats to society. Talk shows debated the case, often treating guilt as a fact rather than a question. The city's anger grew louder every day, yet behind the headlines, the truth was not so simple. Some reporters and lawyers pointed out the problems with the case. The boys' confessions often did not match one another. Some details of their stories clashed with the timeline. There were questions about the physical evidence, but those quieter voices were drowned out by the roar of public opinion. For the boys' families, the situation was heartbreaking. They saw their children described as criminals before the trial had even begun. Mothers and fathers stood outside courthouses pleading for fairness. Some of them cried openly in front of cameras, begging people to understand their children were not capable of such violence. But sympathy was rare. Meanwhile, the boys were moved into juvenile detention facilities. For many, it was their first time away from home, their first time inside a system built for punishment. They were scared, unsure, and confused. Some tried to stay strong, while others broke down in tears. Their childhoods had ended overnight. As the case prepared to go to trial, prosecutors worked hard to build their arguments. They leaned heavily on the confessions, treating them as the strongest proof. They also highlighted the atmosphere of that night in the park, the group of teenagers moving through and causing trouble. To the jury, they would argue that the attack was the natural outcome of chaos. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, pointed to the holes. They reminded the court that the victim could not identify her attackers. They questioned the methods used by the police. They argued that the boys had been pressured, that their words were not reliable. It was going to be a battle of stories, one that the whole country would be watching. The case also became political. Leaders across the city weighed in, some calling for stronger policing, others warning about unfair treatment. The case was no longer just about the park. It had become a test of New York itself, its justice system, its communities, and its deep divisions. On the streets, people kept arguing. Some shouted that the boys deserved the harshest punishment possible. Others whispered that something about the story didn't make sense. Taxi drivers, shop owners, teachers, and students, everyone had an opinion. And every opinion seemed to make the city more divided. The boys, meanwhile, sat quietly in their cells, waiting. They were too young to fully grasp the storm around them, but they could feel the weight. They heard the guards talk. They saw the headlines. They knew the city believed they were guilty, and they feared what was coming next. By the time the trial date was set, the Central Park case was no longer just news. It was history in the making. Families on both sides braced themselves for what would come. Reporters lined up outside courthouses, ready to capture every moment, and ordinary New Yorkers prepared to watch the city's deepest fears and tensions play out in a courtroom. The boys' fate now rested not in the hands of the police, but in the hands of the court. The trial was about to begin, and with it, the next chapter in a story that had already divided a city and captured the attention of the world. The trial began under the weight of enormous attention. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse every morning, waiting to see the families arrive, waiting for a glimpse of the boys as they were brought in under heavy guard. Reporters filled the hallways, pushing microphones toward anyone willing to speak. Inside, the courtroom was packed with lawyers, journalists, and members of the public who wanted to witness the drama unfold. The prosecution opened with a clear and strong story. They told the jury that the group of boys had gone into Central Park as a pack, causing chaos, and eventually carried out a brutal attack. They repeated the word wolf pack, a phrase that had already spread through the media, and argued that the boys acted together. They read out the confessions as if they were fact, showing the jury that the boys had admitted to being involved. For many listening, the confessions sounded convincing. They were detailed, they described the attack, and they seemed to place the teenagers at the scene. The prosecution also played videotaped statements, letting the jury see the boys' own words. It was powerful evidence, and it shaped the way many people viewed the case. But the defense pushed back. They told the jury that the confessions were false, made under pressure and fear. They explained how the boys had been questioned for long hours without proper protection, how parents were kept away, and how the detectives had pushed the boys into saying what they wanted to hear. The lawyers reminded the jury that there was no DNA evidence tying the boys to the crime, no fingerprints, no clear physical proof. The courtroom became a battleground. Witnesses were called to the stand, some describing what they saw that night in the park, others speaking about the boys themselves. Some witnesses gave confused or conflicting accounts, and the defense used this to argue that the truth was unclear. But the prosecution always returned to the confessions, insisting they were the strongest evidence of guilt. The victim herself could not testify about what had happened. She had no memory of the attack, and she had suffered lasting injuries. Her presence, though, was powerful. When the jury saw her in court, sitting quietly with her family, the room grew heavy with silence. She was a reminder of the crime's brutality, even if she could not identify who had harmed her. Outside the courtroom, the city was consumed by the trial. Every evening, the news replayed the day's events. Commentators debated on television, often leaning toward guilt. Headlines carried dramatic language, making it seem as though the verdict had already been decided. Families across New York watched the trial like a daily drama, each side holding firm to their beliefs. In Harlem, the families of the boys gathered in prayer and protest. They spoke to the press, insisting their children were innocent, begging for people to see the case more clearly. Many in their community supported them, but the wider city often dismissed their voices. The boys' mothers and fathers felt alone, fighting against a wave that seemed impossible to stop. The boys themselves sat silently during the trial. They were dressed in suits that looked too big for them, their faces showing both fear and confusion. They listened as adults argued about their lives, their futures, and their freedom. Sometimes they lowered their heads, sometimes they whispered to their lawyers, but mostly they remained quiet, overwhelmed by the courtroom's weight. As weeks passed, the trial became more intense. The defense questioned the reliability of the police work. They pointed out that the boys' confessions did not match one another in key details. Different descriptions of the victim's clothing, different accounts of who did what, different timelines. They asked the jury how all of them could be telling the truth if their stories conflicted, but the prosecution had an answer for everything. They argued that in a chaotic event, it was natural for memories to be confused. They said the small differences did not matter because the bigger picture was the same. The boys had admitted to being involved, and that, they claimed, was enough. The jury listened carefully, day after day. They saw the victim, they heard the families, and they watched as lawyers battled fiercely. Some jurors later admitted they felt the weight of the entire city on their shoulders. It was not just a trial anymore. It was a question of safety, of justice, and of the city's fears. When closing arguments came, the prosecution painted the boys as dangerous, insisting the evidence proved their guilt. They spoke of protecting the city, of sending a message that crimes like this would not be tolerated. The defense pleaded for fairness, begging the jury to see the holes, to see the boys as children who had been pushed into false words. The courtroom was silent as the jury left to deliberate. Hours passed, then days. The families waited in agony, sitting together, whispering prayers, holding on to hope or fear. The city held its breath, knowing the verdict would be one of the most important in years. When the jury finally returned, the air grew tense. The boys sat at the table with their lawyers, their hands shaking, their eyes wide. Their parents gripped each other tightly. The foreman stood and read the verdicts, guilty on most charges. The courtroom exploded. Some gasped, some cried, some shouted. The boys' mothers wept openly, their cries filling the room. The victim's family held hands, tears in their eyes, believing justice had been served. Reporters rushed out of the courtroom to deliver the news to the world. In the streets, reactions were immediate. Many celebrated the verdict, saying it proved the system worked. Others were devastated, believing innocent children had just been condemned. The divide in the city grew even deeper. The boys were sentenced to years behind bars. For them, the reality hit slowly. They had gone from teenagers playing in the park to convicted criminals in the eyes of the world. Their lives would never be the same again. The Central Park case had reached its courtroom conclusion, but the story was far from over. The verdict had answered one question, but it had left behind many others. Questions about justice, about race, about truth, and about how a city so quick to judge could ever know for sure what had really happened that night in the park. The verdicts left the city shaken. For some, it was the end of a nightmare. They believed justice had been served and that New York was safer now that the boys were behind bars. But for others, the trial felt like a terrible mistake. A story of young lives ruined by a system that cared more about fear than about truth. The 5 boys, still teenagers, were sent away to serve their sentences. Some went to juvenile facilities, while others were placed in prisons where the environment was far harsher. Their days changed completely. The sound of metal doors closing, the routine of strict rules, and the constant presence of guards became their new reality. For the families, the pain was unbearable. Mothers visited their sons, bringing food and clothing, holding them tightly during short visits before being forced to leave again. Fathers stood quietly, often too heartbroken to find words. Brothers and sisters asked when their siblings would come home, but no one could answer. Life outside prison moved on, but the shadow of the case never faded. In Harlem, the community felt the weight of the verdict. People whispered about whether the boys had really done it, or if they had been trapped in a story they could not escape. Some defended them fiercely, saying the city had sacrificed them to satisfy fear. Others avoided the topic altogether, afraid of drawing attention. In wealthier parts of New York, the case was spoken of as a victory. People pointed to it as proof that the system could handle even the most frightening crimes. But underneath, even some of those voices wondered quietly if the story was truly complete. For the boys, prison life was difficult. They were young, inexperienced, and unprepared for the harshness of confinement. Some faced bullying and violence inside. Others tried to keep their heads down, following the rules and waiting for time to pass. Letters from family gave them strength, but the years stretched out long ahead of them. Meanwhile, the victim struggled with recovery. Her injuries had been severe, and she faced a long road back to health. She worked hard with doctors and family support, but her memory of the attack never returned. She tried to rebuild her life, carrying the weight of what had happened even as the city placed her at the center of its debates. The media did not let the case go. Even after the trial, newspapers ran stories about the convicted boys, sometimes painting them as symbols of danger, sometimes using their case as an example of youth violence. Their names became tied forever to the park, to that night, and to the city's fears. For the boys, even inside prison, they could feel the world watching them. Years passed slowly. Each birthday behind bars reminded them of how much they had lost. Childhood had ended the night of the arrest, and adulthood was being lived inside concrete walls. They dreamed of freedom, of walking outside again, of returning to their families. But hope was fragile. For the city, the case continued to spark division. At family dinners, people argued over whether the verdicts had been right. On talk shows, experts debated the meaning of the case. Some said it showed the need for tough laws. Others said it showed how unfair the system could be to the young and the poor. The Central Park case remained a wound that refused to heal. In Harlem, mothers warned their children to be careful, reminding them how quickly lives could be changed. Fathers told stories of injustice, teaching their sons to be cautious with authority. The case became a lesson, a warning passed down. For the victim's family, life was also marked by the event. They lived with both sorrow and relief. Sorrow for what their daughter had endured, and relief that someone had been punished. But deep down, they too carried questions because the truth of that night had never been fully clear. The boys' lawyers continued to fight. Even after the verdict, they appealed, pointing out problems in the case. They spoke about the lack of physical evidence, about the contradictions in the confessions, and about the unfairness of the trial. But appeals were rejected, and the years continued to pass. Each of the boys carried his own struggles inside. Some found religion, seeking comfort in faith. Others leaned on friendships they built in prison. A few tried to keep studying, determined not to let their education slip away completely. But all of them carried the weight of being branded guilty by an entire city. Outside, the world was changing. New York moved into the 1990s, and crime rates began to shift. News stories filled the headlines. But the Central Park case never disappeared. It was remembered, discussed, and argued over, a symbol of the city's darkest fears. Time inside prison passed unevenly. Some days dragged endlessly while others disappeared quickly. Holidays were the hardest, with the boys thinking about family gatherings they could not attend, meals they could not share, and laughter they could only imagine. Letters and visits kept them connected. But the distance was always painful. The city, too, had changed. New mayors came and went, new policies were put in place, and the face of New York evolved. But whenever the case was mentioned, emotions resurfaced as strongly as before. The divide that began in 1989 remained alive. For the boys, each year behind bars was a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Some still held on to the hope that one day the truth would come out. Others tried not to think too far ahead, focusing only on surviving one day at a time. The Central Park case was no longer just a trial or a story. It had become a symbol of justice, of injustice, of fear, and of hope, all depending on who was telling it. And though the verdicts had been read and the sentences handed down, the real ending of the story had not yet arrived. Somewhere in the city, hidden within time, the truth about that night still waited to be revealed. Years slipped by, but the memory of the Central Park case never faded. The boys grew into young men inside prison walls, carrying the weight of the guilty labels placed on them. Each of them served long sentences, their youth spent in places filled with noise, fear, and endless routine. Some tried to stay strong, while others broke under the pressure. But all of them carried the same pain, the feeling that their lives had been stolen. Outside, their families never gave up. Mothers continued to visit, carrying food, clothes, and words of encouragement. Fathers worked hard to hold their families together, though the sadness often showed in their eyes. Brothers and sisters grew up while the boys were locked away, their relationships frozen in time. Family photos showed birthdays, weddings, and gatherings where empty chairs always stood as reminders of the missing. Lawyers and activists continued to question the case. They spoke about the confessions that didn't match, about the lack of physical evidence, and about how the police had handled the boys. Books and articles began to appear, raising doubts about whether justice had really been served. Yet for many, the story of guilt had already been written, and it was hard to erase. The city changed as the years moved into the 1990s. Crime rates shifted, new leaders came into power, and the culture of New York evolved. But the Central Park case still appeared in discussions, a story people could not let go of. Some used it as an example of why the city needed tougher policing. Others saw it as a lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment. For the victim, life was a long process of healing. She worked to rebuild her strength, surrounded by family and doctors. She never regained memory of what had happened that night, but her courage in facing each day became part of the story as well. People admired her for surviving something so terrible, even as debates about the case swirled around her. The young men, now older, lived with the struggles of prison life. Some found comfort in religion, spending hours reading scriptures and praying for strength. Others focused on education, using time behind bars to study and prepare for the future, even if the future felt uncertain. But no matter what they did, the label of guilt stayed with them, shaping how guards, inmates, and even strangers viewed them. As the years went on, public opinion began to shift slowly. More people started to ask questions. Television specials revisited the case, this time with a different tone. They showed the contradictions in the confessions, the lack of evidence, and the possibility that the boys had been trapped by a system eager to close the case quickly. For the first time, larger audiences began to wonder if the truth had been hidden. In Harlem, families continued to speak out. Community leaders held meetings, calling for fairness and for the boys' names to be cleared. They argued that the case was never about truth, but about fear, race, and pressure. Their voices grew louder, but it still felt like they were fighting against a giant wall. The men themselves, though hardened by years inside, held on to hope. They believed one day the truth would come out. They wanted the world to see them not as criminals, but as sons, brothers, and human beings whose lives had been unfairly destroyed. Hope was all they had, and they clung to it even in the darkest moments. Time kept passing. Some of the men finished their sentences and were released. Stepping back into New York after so many years was like stepping into another world. The city looked different. New buildings, new technology, and new ways of life. Yet, even outside prison, they were not free. The word guilty followed them everywhere. Jobs were hard to find, relationships were difficult, and neighbors often whispered behind their backs. They carried the weight of being known as the Central Park Five. It was a name that stuck to them, one that made people see them only through the lens of that night. They tried to rebuild their lives, but the past was always chasing them. Some pushed forward with determination, while others struggled with the invisible chains of their convictions. Meanwhile, debates about the justice system grew stronger. More cases were coming to light where people had been wrongly convicted. DNA technology was advancing, allowing scientists to test evidence in ways that had not been possible before. Lawyers began to wonder if this technology might hold the key to unlocking the truth about Central Park. The case was no longer just about 5 young men and 1 victim. It had become a mirror held up to the city itself. It revealed fear, bias, anger, and the desperate need for justice, even at the cost of fairness. And it left people asking difficult questions. Did the system protect the innocent? Or did it sometimes create victims of its own? For years, the men lived in the shadow of that question. Their families never stopped fighting. Their lawyers never stopped appealing. And across New York, people never stopped arguing about what had happened in the park. The city was still divided, and the truth still felt out of reach. But history has a way of uncovering secrets. And one day, long after the trials and the verdicts, something would happen that would change everything. It would shake the city once again, not with fear this time, but with the revelation of a truth that had been buried for years. The Central Park case was not finished. The final chapter had yet to be written, and when it arrived, it would force New York and the entire country to face the reality of what had been done in the name of justice. More than a decade had passed since the night in Central Park, and the city had changed in countless ways. But the shadow of the case never disappeared. For the 5 men who had once been teenagers, the memories of prison, the pain of being labeled guilty, and the struggle of rebuilding their lives were still present every day. They lived with the weight of being judged, always looking over their shoulders, always carrying the name the city had given them. Then, something unexpected happened. In the early 2000s, a man already serving time for other crimes came forward. His name was Matias Reyes, and he admitted that he alone had been responsible for the attack in Central Park. At first, it seemed unbelievable. Why would someone confess after all these years? But Reyes gave details that only the true attacker could know. He described the scene in ways that matched the evidence. The confession set off a storm. Lawyers and investigators reopened the case, this time using DNA technology that had advanced far beyond what was possible in 1989. The results were clear. The DNA found at the crime scene matched only Reyes. None of the 5 men had been involved. The truth that had been buried for more than a decade was now undeniable. The reaction was explosive. For the 5 men, it was both relief and heartbreak. Relief because the world now knew they had been innocent all along. Heartbreak because years of their lives had been stolen, years they could never get back. They had lost their childhoods, their opportunities, and time with their families, all for a crime they did not commit. Their families wept with both joy and sorrow. They had fought for so long to clear their sons' names, and finally the truth was revealed. But the pain of what had been done, the damage caused by fear and rush to judgment, could never be erased. The city of New York was forced to face itself. Officials admitted mistakes. The case that had once divided the city now stood as an example of injustice. People began to ask harder questions. How could this have happened? Why had the system failed so badly? And how many others had suffered the same fate? The media, which had once called the boys monsters and predators, now ran stories about their innocence. The same headlines that had destroyed their lives were replaced with words of apology, though for many, the apologies felt too late. Television specials, documentaries, and books revisited the case, this time telling the story from the perspective of the wrongly accused. The men, now adults, began to speak publicly. They told their stories, describing the pain of being children trapped in a system that refused to listen. They spoke of the nights in prison, the tears of their families, and the years they could never recover. Their words carried power, reminding people of the human cost of injustice. The city eventually offered them a settlement, a financial payment meant to recognize the harm that had been done. But no amount of money could erase the past. What they wanted most was not money. It was dignity, respect, and acknowledgement that they had been wronged. The victim herself, still living with the scars of that night, accepted the truth of the new evidence. She had never remembered the attack, and she had lived for years believing the story told by police and courts. Now she too was faced with the reality that justice had been denied, not only to her, but also to the 5 men who had been wrongly accused. The case became a lesson taught in classrooms, studied by lawyers and debated in public forums. It showed how fear and prejudice could shape justice, how the rush to solve a crime could destroy innocent lives, and how the truth, no matter how long it takes, always has a way of coming out. For New York, the Central Park case remained one of its most painful chapters. It revealed deep divides of race, class, and trust in the system. It left scars that would not heal easily. But it also gave rise to voices calling for change, voices demanding better protections for the innocent, fairer trials, and a justice system that values truth over pressure. The 5 men, once broken by their experiences, slowly began to rebuild. They worked, they spoke, they became symbols of survival. They showed that even in the face of terrible injustice, people can rise, tell their stories, and fight for something better. Their journey from accused to vindicated became a powerful reminder of resilience, and yet the pain remained. Each of them had lost years that could never return. Missed birthdays, lost dreams, broken families, those were wounds that time could not fully heal. But in telling their stories, they ensured the world would remember. The Central Park case, once a story that divided New York, became something more. It became a story that challenged the nation to look at itself, to question its systems, and to promise never to let such an injustice happen again. New York City moved forward, but the memory of that night in 1989 stayed alive. It was a reminder of how quickly fear could blind justice, and how easily lives could be destroyed. And it was also a reminder that truth, even when buried for years, could still rise to the surface and change everything. In the end, the Central Park case was not just about a crime in a park. It was about people, innocent teenagers, a victim who survived, families who suffered, and a city that learned the hardest of lessons. It was about justice lost and justice found, and the heavy cost in between. The story that once divided New York now stands as a warning, a lesson, and a call for fairness. And though time has passed, its echoes still remain, whispering through the city, reminding everyone of the price of rushing to judgment and the importance of fighting for the truth. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends.